Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. I should have known something was wrong that night when Lisa came home late, claiming she'd lost track of time while out with her work friends. She didn't come in tired or rushed, like someone eager to put the day behind them. Instead, she moved around the house with a calm, detached energy, almost like she was here in body but somewhere else in spirit. I brushed it off. After all, we'd been married nearly 20 years. People change, and I'd assumed that our quiet companionship was simply part of getting older together. I started noticing more small things after that night, a subtle change in her perfume, outfits that seemed a little too stylish for a typical office setting, hushed phone conversations that ended as soon as I walked into the room. But I let it go. Lisa was dedicated to her career, and her job was demanding. She managed accounts for a major marketing firm and often needed to network, spend long hours at events, and entertain clients. It was part of her world, and I wasn't going to question it. We were solid, I thought. If anything, she was the rock in our relationship, the one who always knew where we stood. We were a team. She had her demanding job, and I had mine as an engineer, often working late hours myself. We had our roles, our routines, and our mutual respect. Or so I believed. I convinced myself that we were simply hitting a midlife stride, just a quieter, less intense version of our younger selves. After all, raising 2 kids had reshaped everything for us, and we'd gone through the typical ups and downs that came with family life. Through it all, I trusted her with everything I had. When our anniversary trip was approaching, I thought it would be a good chance to reconnect. We hadn't been away together in a long time, and I wanted to remind her, and maybe myself, of the life we'd built together. So I went all out on planning a trip she would love. I picked a quiet cabin near the lake where we first vacationed as newlyweds. I had surprises planned, small, nostalgic gestures meant to bring us back to those early days. This was supposed to be a chance to rekindle whatever it was that had faded, to reconnect as a couple rather than as the parents and professionals we'd become. The day before we were set to leave, I decided to help her pack, thinking I'd slip a little note into her suitcase, a simple reminder of how much she meant to me. But when I opened her travel bag, my eye caught something tucked into an inner pocket. It was an envelope, neatly folded, with her name written in someone else's handwriting. I stared at it for a moment, a cold tension tightening in my chest. I had never invaded her privacy before. It felt wrong, but there was something about that envelope that set off 100 small alarms inside me. Taking a deep breath, I unfolded it, trying to shake off the sudden dread gnawing at my gut. The words were like a punch to the stomach. It was a love letter, heartfelt, raw, and signed by someone named Jake. He wrote about the time they'd spent together, how he missed her, how he couldn't wait until their next business trip so they could have more nights together. I read it twice, slowly, hoping somehow the words would shift, that I'd misunderstood. But it was clear as day, my wife was having an affair. I couldn't breathe. The house seemed suddenly too small, too stifling. I dropped the letter, feeling the floor give way beneath me. I don't know how long I sat there in stunned silence, replaying every moment from the past few months, every late night and cancelled date, every flimsy excuse she had given me. It all came flooding back, but with a sharp clarity I'd ignored for too long. That night, I confronted her. I waited until after the kids were asleep, until there was no one around but us. She tried to deny it, her eyes wide with shock, scrambling for an excuse, but the letter was the one piece of evidence she couldn't explain away. Eventually, she admitted it. She said it had started months ago, that she hadn't meant for it to happen, that she still loved me but felt like she was missing something. All the usual lines I'd read about, the ones I'd never thought I'd hear in my own home. I was devastated. It felt like the life I knew, the woman I loved, had been torn away in an instant. But that devastation quickly turned to anger, a deep, simmering fury. Here I was, blindsided, humiliated, with my life unraveling in a matter of minutes, and she was asking for my understanding, my forgiveness. She wanted me to forget it ever happened, to move on and pretend we could go back to the way things were. As we argued, the absurdity of it all became almost unbearable. She didn't seem sorry for what she'd done, only sorry that I had found out. She tried to justify it, saying she needed space, that she'd felt stifled, that her job was demanding so much of her. Then she said something that nearly broke me, "I love you, but you need to let me have this." That sentence hung in the air like a threat, a challenge. She was asking me to accept her affair, to simply tolerate it as though it was some unfortunate habit she couldn't break. I don't remember every word I said in response, but I remember the feeling, the anger, the frustration, the helplessness. I remember shouting, feeling the walls close in, my entire world slipping through my fingers. Finally, I looked her in the eye and said, "I'd rather not." Those words weren't planned, but they came out with a force I didn't know I had. They were simple, yet they said everything. I wasn't going to stand by while she continued to betray me. I wasn't going to sit silently in a marriage where love had been traded for deceit. The next few days were a blur. I felt numb, empty, like I was living someone else's life. Lisa tried to patch things up, promising me that this would be the last time, that she would stop seeing him. But I couldn't believe her. I didn't want to. The trust, the love, the life we built together had been shattered beyond repair. As she continued to press me to let her stay, I became colder, more distant. Her pleas felt hollow, her promises meaningless. I couldn't bring myself to forgive her. I didn't want to. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice, one she had made time and time again. So I made my own choice. I would leave her. The days that followed my decision were surreal, as if I were drifting through a half-formed dream. I told Lisa I was leaving, but I couldn't bring myself to move out right away. There were too many loose ends to tie up, too many memories piled up in every room, every corner of our home. We had 2 kids, after all, and each day felt like a fresh punishment, an unspoken reminder of everything I was about to lose. Lisa acted stunned at first, like she couldn't believe I'd actually go through with it. She thought I'd calmed down, that this was just an emotional outburst. But when she saw I meant it, that I wasn't just making empty threats, her surprise quickly shifted into something uglier. We fought every night, and it became clear that this was going to be no peaceful parting. There was venom in her words that I hadn't heard before. At times, I could hardly recognize the woman standing in front of me. Each night, after putting the kids to bed, I would sit in our bedroom, struggling with the ghosts of our life together. I'd remember when we first moved into this house, young and hopeful, painting walls and picking out furniture, every little detail chosen with care. Now it all seemed so trivial, as if I'd built my life on the shifting sand of lies and betrayal. The memories once filled with laughter and love felt hollow and bitter. Eventually, I could barely stand to look at her. Lisa's empty apologies, her attempts at reconciliation, her sudden professions of love, each one seemed as insincere as the last. She'd say anything, promise anything, as long as it kept her world intact. But I wasn't interested in keeping up the charade. I wanted out. One evening, after another argument that went in circles, I decided it was time to take the first concrete step. I was going to talk to a divorce lawyer. I hadn't told her yet, but I wanted to be prepared. The thought of divorce was something I'd never entertained, not seriously. But now, the idea of being free from the constant cycle of deceit and disappointment felt like a lifeline. The next day, I took off work early and drove across town to the office of Jack Barnes, a lawyer recommended to me by a friend who'd gone through a divorce the previous year. Jack was an older man, with graying hair and a calm demeanor that felt oddly comforting. I expected a slick, corporate type, but Jack was grounded, direct. He listened as I laid out my situation, nodding thoughtfully as I stumbled through the details of Lisa's affair and my decision to end things. "Divorce is tough, especially with kids," he said, leaning back in his chair. It's not just the separation, it's the fallout, the way it impacts everyone involved. I can help you get through it, but you'll need to be ready for the long haul. If you want full custody, or even shared custody, things might get messy. Custody. I hadn't let myself think about that yet. The thought of not seeing my kids every day felt like a fresh wound. I hadn't realized until that moment just how much I'd been holding back, compartmentalizing everything in my head to avoid the sheer weight of what was happening. But the mention of custody shattered that wall I'd been trying to keep intact. Jack gave me a list of documents to gather and asked me to come back in a week. I left his office feeling both relieved and terrified. This was real. There was no going back. The week passed slowly. I kept my meetings with Jack a secret from Lisa, though I sensed she was growing suspicious. She started to follow my every move around the house, watching me with a nervous intensity. I could tell she wanted to ask questions, to figure out what I was up to, but she was too proud to admit she no longer knew my plans. One night, after the kids were asleep, Lisa came into the living room where I was sitting. She had a look of determination, a forced calm that I recognized all too well. I could tell she'd rehearsed what she was about to say, the way she always did when she had something difficult to tell me. "I know you're angry," she started, her voice measured. "I get that. But don't you think this is going too far?" "Going too far?" I repeated, barely able to contain my disbelief. "Lisa, you betrayed me. This isn't just some small mistake we can sweep under the rug." She hesitated, glancing down at her hands, her carefully planned words faltering. "I know, and I'm sorry. I really am. But I don't understand why you have to throw everything away because of one mistake." "One mistake?" "It wasn't one mistake, Lisa," I replied, my voice rising. "You didn't just slip up. You lied to me, you lied to our kids, you lied to everyone we know. You built an entire life behind my back." She shook her head, looking frustrated. "It wasn't like that. I didn't mean for it to happen, it just did. I was lonely, okay? I felt like we drifted apart." I stared at her, struggling to comprehend her logic. "So instead of talking to me, you turned to him. And now you're asking me to just forgive and forget? To keep living as though nothing happened?" She didn't answer, her silence saying more than words ever could. I saw the defeat in her eyes, a glimpse of the life she knew slipping away from her grasp. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but the anger was stronger, the betrayal too fresh. That night, I moved into the guest room. It was a small act, but it felt like a statement, a way of claiming some distance, some space of my own. Lisa's presence had become suffocating, every word she said only digging the knife deeper. I didn't want to share a bed with her, to pretend that things could be fixed with half-hearted apologies. The next morning, I told her I'd hired a lawyer. She looked stunned, as though she hadn't believed I'd actually follow through. Her face fell, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear. She tried to bargain, to negotiate, but I held my ground. This wasn't up for discussion. I was done. From that day on, our lives became a series of tense silences, careful avoidance, and thinly veiled resentment. We barely spoke, communicating only when absolutely necessary. I focused on gathering the documents Jack had requested, quietly building my case while she grew increasingly desperate. Then, about a week later, she made a last-ditch effort. She asked me to sit down, and I could see the forced calm on her face, the desperation in her eyes. "I don't want to lose you," she said quietly. "Can't we at least try counseling? For the kids, if not for us?" I looked at her, feeling the weight of her request, the sadness behind her words. Part of me wanted to say yes, to believe that things could be fixed. But I couldn't ignore the anger, the betrayal, the constant echo of her words, "I love you, but you need to let me have this." "No, Lisa," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I can't pretend anymore. I can't be the husband you want me to be, and I can't keep living like this. It's over. She blinked, her face crumpling as the reality sank in. She knew it was final, that there was nothing she could say to change my mind. She stood up, her shoulders slumping, and left the room without another word. That night, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The end was coming, and while it hurt, there was a small, quiet part of me that was finally ready to let go. As the days went by, the tension in the house was suffocating. Lisa and I were locked in this silent war, each of us retreating further into ourselves. Our conversations became clipped and practical, revolving around schedules for the kids and logistics. It felt strange, as though we were strangers cohabiting, unwilling to confront the huge, ugly truth that lay between us. I noticed the kids were picking up on the shift in the house. Our son, Sam, a teenager with the quiet confidence I'd always envied, seemed to keep more to himself, headphones on, eyes trained on his phone or his computer. His silence was deafening, a constant reminder of what my anger and Lisa's betrayal were doing to our family. Our younger daughter, Lily, still in elementary school, clung to us both in a way that felt heavy, her questions too innocent and piercing. Why don't you and Mommy have dinner together anymore? She'd ask me, her big eyes filled with confusion. Those questions broke me. I felt guilty, like I was the one shattering the only reality they'd known. But every time I even thought about stepping back from my decision, I remembered that letter in Lisa's bag, the deception she'd carried so easily. I couldn't trust her, and I knew that pretending for the kids' sake would only make things worse. Still, I couldn't bear seeing them hurt. It kept me up at night, wondering how this would affect them. I wondered if there was some way to shield them from the fallout, to explain without tearing them apart. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. One night, a few weeks after I'd told Lisa about the lawyer, I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of her. She was crying softly, her head bent, shoulders slumped in a way that made her look smaller, almost fragile. It took me a moment to recognize what she was looking at, an album of family photos, with pictures of us from vacations, family gatherings, and holidays. I watched her for a moment, unsure if I should walk away or say something. When she looked up and saw me standing there, her face crumpled further. She gestured to the photo album. "How did we get here, Will?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We were so happy once." I felt a twinge of something, maybe regret, maybe nostalgia, but definitely a lingering sadness that was impossible to ignore. "That's what I thought, too," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But then you decided you needed something, or someone else." She flinched, and for the first time, I felt a sense of satisfaction from her pain. Maybe it was petty, but I couldn't help it. She betrayed me, and part of me wanted her to hurt as much as I was hurting. "It wasn't about him," she said quietly, wiping her tears. "It was about feeling alive, about feeling seen. You were so distant." Her words stung, but I knew she was twisting things to justify her actions. "I was distant because I trusted you," I shot back. "I thought I didn't have to question every business trip or late night. I thought you were happy, that we were happy." "I was happy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But somewhere along the way, we lost each other." For a moment, her vulnerability softened my anger, but the thought of her with someone else, laughing, sharing secrets, tore through me again. I shook my head. "We didn't lose each other. You chose to turn away from me, to lie to me." There was a long silence between us, the weight of our shattered marriage filling the air. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I left the room, leaving her with the photos, the memories that were now tarnished and broken. The next day, I met with Jack again, and we began filing the divorce papers. Jack advised me to prepare for what might come next, that Lisa would probably fight me for custody, that things could get messy. I dreaded that thought more than anything else. I wanted to keep the peace for the kids' sake, but I knew Lisa, and I knew that once she felt cornered, she would retaliate. Over the following weeks, things turned cold and businesslike between us. We avoided each other as much as possible, speaking only when necessary, tiptoeing around the kids' routines. The process was brutal. Dividing assets, discussing custody schedules, and going over every little detail of the life we'd built together was excruciating. Then, one evening, as we were both in the living room organizing things to move into storage, Lisa spoke up, breaking the silence. "You know, I never wanted it to end this way," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "I kept packing, not willing to let myself engage." "Well, maybe you should have thought of that before." She sighed, and for a moment, I thought she would start crying again, but instead, she steadied herself. "Do you really hate me that much?" she asked, her voice hollow. I stopped what I was doing, looking at her. "I don't hate you, Lisa. But I don't trust you either. And that's the real problem, isn't it?" She nodded, accepting what we both already knew. There was nothing left to salvage. By the time the divorce was finalized, I felt drained. We had agreed on a custody arrangement that was more or less equal, but every drop-off and pick-up felt like another wound, another reminder of the life we'd lost. I'd moved into a small apartment nearby to stay close to the kids, but it felt hollow, empty. I missed them every minute they weren't with me. The bitterness of the past months began to fade, replaced by a heavy sadness. The anger I'd held onto for so long melted away, and all I was left with was the empty reality of my new life. I spent nights alone, replaying everything in my head, wondering if there had been some moment, some pivotal choice where things had gone wrong. One night, after dropping off the kids at Lisa's, I went for a drive. I ended up at the park where we used to take the kids when they were younger. I parked and sat there for a while, watching families walking by, children laughing, couples holding hands. It hit me then, harder than ever, that I would never have that with Lisa again. I would never have the life I had once imagined. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rebuild, to focus on my kids, my work, and what little social life I had left. I saw friends I hadn't seen in years, threw myself into projects at work, anything to keep myself busy. But it was hard. Everywhere I went, every small moment, felt tinged with what I'd lost. Lisa tried reaching out a few times, sending messages about things we'd left unresolved, but I kept my distance. I didn't need closure from her. I needed to find it within myself. One weekend, when I had the kids, we went to the lake, the same one where I'd planned to take Lisa before everything fell apart. We rented a small boat, fished, and cooked out, laughing and telling stories. It was bittersweet, but it reminded me that I still had a life to live, that I still had people who loved me and needed me. I started to realize that maybe this was my new beginning. Not one I'd wanted or asked for, but one I could shape on my own. Months passed, and I settled into my new life, though settling might be too generous a word. The loneliness lingered, a dull ache that came and went, but I was getting by, filling my time with work, friends, and, most importantly, the kids. They were my only anchor now, the bright spots in a life that felt perpetually overcast. Every weekend I had them, I tried to make it special, something that would remind them that we still had a family, even if it wasn't the family I'd once promised them. Lisa and I had fallen into a pattern of polite indifference. We kept exchanges brief, usually just a few words when I dropped the kids off. She'd always give them a long hug before letting them go, and I tried not to watch. It was better this way, cleaner, easier, without words to stir up the dust. One evening, just as I'd finished putting the kids to bed, I received an unexpected call. Lisa's name flashed on the screen, and my heart sank. She hadn't called me directly in months. Something had to be wrong. "Hello?" I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, and I could hear her breathing on the other end, shallow and shaky. "Will," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry to call so late. I didn't know who else." "What's wrong?" I asked, feeling an instinctive wave of concern, despite everything that had passed between us. There was a beat of silence before she spoke again. It's nothing. Just. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. Her voice sounded fragile, more vulnerable than I'd ever heard it. I waited, unsure of what to say. I could hear her sniffle on the other end, and it felt like there was something pressing, something she couldn't bring herself to tell me. Lisa, what's going on? I finally asked. A shuddered breath broke through the line, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice, as though she was weighing her words carefully. I didn't want you to know, but I'm not sure I can keep this from you much longer. She paused, and I could feel the tension vibrating between us. I'm sick. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. It's cancer, she continued quietly, as though confessing a secret. It's advanced. I didn't want to tell you, or the kids. I thought I'd have more time to handle it on my own, but I'm not sure I can keep it up. I felt my hands go cold, the phone slipping slightly as I tried to process her words. Cancer. The woman I had loved, the mother of my children, the woman who'd hurt me more deeply than anyone, was dying. How long have you known? I finally managed to ask, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. A few months, she replied, her voice breaking. I didn't want you to feel sorry for me. I didn't want you to hate me less just because of this. My mind raced. She had hidden this from me, from the kids, carrying it alone even as we battled through the divorce. My first instinct was anger, a fresh wave of resentment that she had kept something this monumental to herself. But it was quickly replaced by something softer, something that felt like grief. Have you told the kids? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No, she whispered. I don't know how. I keep telling myself that I'll find the right time, but the longer I wait, the harder it gets. Her voice cracked again, and suddenly, I could see her as she once was, vulnerable and real. The sharp edges of my resentment softened, replaced by the memories of her as the mother of my children, the woman I'd once promised to love through sickness and health. Lisa, I began slowly, I can help. We can tell them together. No, she said quickly, the words almost a plea. Please, don't. I want them to remember me as their mom, strong and not broken. I need to do this on my own. Her words hung heavy between us, and a wave of helplessness washed over me. I wanted to argue, to fight her on this, but I knew her well enough to realize it was a battle I'd lose. She was as stubborn as ever, determined to protect them, even if it meant shutting me out. Then let me help you, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't want you to go through this alone, Lisa. There was silence on the line, but I could sense her gratitude, even if she couldn't bring herself to say it. Thank you, she whispered, and before I could respond, she ended the call, leaving me alone with the quiet of my empty apartment. The days that followed were a blur. Lisa kept her word, not telling the kids, and our routine remained as normal as possible. But each time I dropped them off, each time I watched her hug them tightly, her face a mask of forced cheerfulness, I felt the weight of her secret growing heavier. As the months passed, her health began to visibly decline. She became gaunt, her skin sallow, her hair thinning. She was careful to hide it from the kids, layering on makeup and energy she didn't have to keep up appearances. I wanted to beg her to stop, to let them see the truth, to prepare them, but I knew it would only add to her suffering. And so, I let her carry on, watching helplessly as she deteriorated before my eyes. Finally, one evening, I received another call, this time from her mother. Lisa had collapsed. She was in the hospital, and it was time. I sat with her that night, watching her sleep, the machines beeping softly around us. She looked so small, so fragile, nothing like the woman I had loved, hated, fought with, and lost. In that moment, none of it mattered. The anger, the betrayal, the bitterness, it all faded away, leaving only a profound sadness. When she woke, her eyes found mine, and a faint smile played on her lips. "You're here," she whispered, her voice thin and tired. "I'm here," I said, taking her hand, feeling the bones beneath her skin. "I'll always be here." A weak smile crossed her face, and for a moment, I could see a flicker of the woman she'd once been. "Tell them I love them, Will. Tell them I tried to be the best mom I could." A lump rose in my throat, and I nodded, fighting back tears. "They know, Lisa. They know." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand squeezing mine. We sat in silence until the morning light crept through the window, casting a pale glow over the room. And as the first rays of dawn brushed against her face, Lisa slipped away, her hand still in mine. In the days that followed, I told the kids the truth, doing my best to explain why their mother had kept her illness from them, why she hadn't wanted them to see her suffer. I tried to be there for them, to let them grieve in their own way, but it felt impossible to bridge the gaping hole her death had left in our lives. At her funeral, I stood with Sam and Lily, feeling the weight of their hands in mine as we said goodbye. And as the service ended, as friends and family filed past us with their whispered condolences, I felt the sharp, searing pain of loss settle into my bones, a grief so deep I couldn't find the words for it. In the end, Lisa and I never had the closure I thought we'd get. She'd left behind more questions than answers, a wound that would never fully heal. But as I stood by her grave, feeling the wind tug at my coat, I knew one thing for certain: I would carry her memory with me always, a quiet ache that would never fade, a reminder of the life, the love, and the heartbreak we had shared.